G'day everyone. Well, yeah, normally you'd be right, but actually we're approaching the coast of Victoria, the state of Victoria, which is the home of Australian rules football, or footy as we know it. So the correct salutation in Victoria is Go Pies, okay? And you've got to say it with vigour and meaning, so it's Go Pies, it comes from the gut, okay? Now the reason that I believe that this is the Collingwood Football Club, by the way. So it is the largest sporting club in Australia, the most popular sporting club, but also, I must say, the most hated sporting club in Australia. If you don't love Collingwood, you must hate Collingwood. Now, the reason that I think that some of you, especially our American friends here, should support Collingwood is that we have a player who is the first and still the only American to play Australian rules football at the highest level. And his name's Mason Cox, and he's known as the American Pie. And here he is. Last year is a semi-final, a huge game against the former premiers of the league. And he came away from that game being voted as the best player on the ground, or the MVP on the ground. And every time he lined up for a goal, the crowd of 90,000, well, half of them, or 50,000 of them, were screaming USA, USA, as he lined up for goal. So the reason I'm telling you this about the American Pie is because tomorrow we're going to be in Geelong, and the season's about to start. This is Geelong, these blue and white hoop colours across there. And in the first game of the season on Friday night, our team, Collingwood, is playing Geelong. So you'll see a lot of Geelong cat stuff when we get to Geelong tomorrow. Ladies, you are absolutely banned from wearing anything blue and white hoops until Saturday. And if you see anyone else around the ship wearing them, make sure you get them to take them off, because it's bad juju, okay? So we'll try it again. Go Pies. Go Pies. Yeah, now we've got it. Well done. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about the man that named Australia, or the voyages of Matthew Flinders. Now, he was born in Lincolnshire, England in 1774, and he said later on that he was induced to go to sea against the wishes of his family and friends from reading Robinson Crusoe. And a few weeks ago we were at Robinson Crusoe Island, and we spoke about that. He joined the Royal Navy at the age of 15, as all good sailors do, and in 1790. In the same year he was promoted to midshipman, and then he joined Captain Bligh aboard the voyage of the Providence, which was the second breadfruit voyage, when Bligh picked up breadfruit in Tahiti and took it to Jamaica. Now, we spoke about this the other day. This was the circumnavigation of the world, where they left England, went to the Canary Islands, then they stopped off in Cape Town, Tasmania, where we were yesterday, Tahiti, and then on to Jamaica. And he really impressed Bligh with his seamanship and his navigation and cartography skills. And when Bligh returned to England, he recommended Flinders to the Admiralty. He sailed to New Holland, as Australia was known at the time, in 1795 aboard HMS Reliance. Now, Reliance was taking the brand new governor, the second governor of New South Wales, to New South Wales to take up his position. But also on board was a man by the name of George Bass. Bass had been born only 11 miles away from Flinders in England, but they two had never met until they boarded the Reliance together, and they became very good friends. Bass was a trained surgeon, and during the voyage he got to treat an Aboriginal man by the name of Bennelong. And while he was treating Bennelong taught him some Aboriginal language skills. Now, Bennelong had been in Sydney when the first fleet arrived at Jackson's Cove, and he had been the main liaison between the settlers of the first fleet and the Aboriginal peoples there. And he had travelled back to England to meet King George III and be part of the court there. But now he was aboard Reliance, heading back to his people in Jackson Cove in Sydney. Now, the Bennelong Point in Sydney Harbour is named in his honour, and that's the land that the Sydney Opera House sits on. You all saw Sydney a few days ago. Also on board was a cat by the name of Trim, and we'll discuss Trim a little bit later on. When they got to the colony, Bass and Flinders did a lot of exploration in Bass's 8-foot boat, which they named Tom Thumb. They travelled about 100 kilometres up, or 100 miles up the coastline of New South Wales. They met several Aboriginal tribes, and because of the language skills that Bennelong had passed on to Bass, they were able to converse with the Aboriginals and actually trade with them as well. And then they got a slightly bigger boat, and they were able to go further. They went with the surgeon's assistant, a young kid by the name of Boy Martin, on all these voyages. And this was some of the very first interactions with Aboriginal people by white settlers. Now, at the time, as we discussed the other day, people thought that New Holland and Van Diemen's Land were joined together, that there was a land between there. They didn't really realise that Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania was separate. But there was rumours about this being separate. So Dr. Bass was sent down on a voyage of discovery down the coast of what we now know as New South Wales and into Victoria, and he went across to what we now know as Western Port Bay, which is the bay just to the east of Port Phillip Bay, where we'll be tomorrow. He couldn't get any further because of the wind and the tide. So he surmised that there must be a strait or a channel through there because of this so much wind and tide. And he went back to Port Jackson and told them about that. And then Flinders was dispatched in a vessel called the Norfolk to go and investigate. And as we discussed the other day, he did the very, very first circumnavigation of Tasmania. And Bass Strait is named, he asked the governor that Bass Strait be named after his friend Dr. George Bass. And Flinders Island, which we're just passing as we speak, was named after Flinders. Now, at the time, Napoleon became interested in this new country, this New Holland. There was thoughts in Europe that perhaps there wasn't just one continent there might be two. There's rumours that there was a huge channel running down between the Gulf of Carpentaria to the north of Australia, all the way through to the Great Australian Bight at the southern end of Australia. And so perhaps there was an opportunity for France here. Britain had already claimed New South Wales, but no one had really claimed the West. And if there was two countries there, two continents, maybe there was an opportunity for France. And the other thing is that the Admiral, Brunei Diaz Castro, had already visited Van Diemen's Land. He had seen he'd reported back what a great fertile place it was, how beautiful it was. And Napoleon was interested in establishing a colony there. Word had got back that Van Diemen's Land was actually an island after Flinders had gone around. So Napoleon decided that he would investigate this and see whether there was opportunities for France at that time. And this started one of the great navigational races in history, a race between Flinders and the Frenchman Nicolas Baudin. Now, Baudin had been born a commoner in 1754, and at the age of 15 he had joined the merchant navy before transferring to La Marine Royale, which was the French navy, and fighting in the American War of Independence on behalf of the French. After the war, he went back into the merchant navy and was involved with slavery off the coast of Africa. He captained some slave ships, but felt very poorly about that, felt very bad for what he had done. And while he was in the Isle de France, which we now know as Mauritius, he met some Austrian scientists, some botanists, and he became very, very interested in their work. And for the next few years, he spent lots of time with these scientists, transporting them all over the world and learning about the science of botany. He was captain of a scientific exploration to the Caribbean on behalf of the French government, and there he discovered new species of plants and wildlife, and he took them back to Paris, and some of these were used in Napoleon's triumphal march back into Paris, celebrating his victories in Italy. And then in 1800, he and a team of scientists went and visited Napoleon and said, we'd like to explore this great southern land. And Napoleon gave him permission and gave him 2 ships in which to do so. And this was going to be a scientific exploration, but it was also going to be an exploration where Napoleon wanted to find out what opportunities there were in the region for France. But England and France were at war at the time, so they had to apply for a passport of safe conduct for Baudin and his 2 ships. That took some time to come through, and it also gave the English an opportunity to find out what they were doing, and this concerned the English, because they wanted to do something about it as well. And just before they set sail, there was a change to their sailing orders, and this came from Josephine Bonaparte herself. They'd been tasked with finding new fauna and flora and bringing back samples, but she wanted live things. She wanted live animals and live plants, and this was a change in the sailing orders, and you didn't argue with Josephine Bonaparte at the time. So they set sail on October 19, 1800, with 2 ships, the Geography and the Naturalist. Now they were supposed to. Baudin had really wanted to take around about 9 scientists with him, and he was a little bit upset when he was allocated 22. He didn't really want 22 people, extra scientists with him, and these were naturalists, zoologists, botanists and artists. The main one being a man by the name of Francois Perron, who would become the nemesis of Baudin, and as we'll see a bit later on. These were the best scientists in France. Napoleon wanted to send his very, very best people, but they were mostly aristocrats, and they didn't like the idea of taking orders from a man who had been a commoner, even though he was the master and commander of this ship. And Baudin suspected very early on that he would have problems with these people. Now, in the meantime, Matthew Flinders was back in England. He had come to the attention of Sir Joseph Banks. Bligh had recommended Flinders to Banks, and Banks had gone and seen Earl Spencer, who was head of the Admiralty at the time. He is one of Lady Diana's ancestors. And Banks had asked that an exploration be made of this circumnavigation be made of New Holland to find out exactly what was there, because the map there was blank lines on the map, and that was agreed to, because the English had also received this paperwork for this passage of a safe passport of safe conduct that Baudin had applied for. So Flinders was given command of HMS Investigator, which was an old collier. A collier was the sort of ship that same as Endeavour, that Cook had taken to the Pacific on his first voyage. It was thought to be ideal for navigation, close in navigation, because it had a shallow draft. It could get in close to the coastline. And it had the other advantage of being that it was surplus to the requirements of the Royal Navy. They were at war with France at the moment. They didn't need this old thing, so they were happy for Flinders to be able to take it. He had to apply for a safe passage from the French as well, so that there would be reciprocity, give and take between the 2 countries. And on April 17, 1801, he married a lady by the name of Anne Chappell, and he promised her that he would take her with him on this voyage of discovery to the New World. They sailed from Spithead. She was on board when they sailed from Spithead in London on July 18, 1801. But by this time, Baudin had already sailed, and he had a 9-month head start. They actually got to Portsmouth, where it was discovered that Anne was on board. And this was completely against Royal Navy regulations, having a woman aboard a Royal Navy ship. So it was discovered. She was ordered off the ship. The Admiralty were very upset, so Joseph Banks was very upset. He felt that Flinders had let him down, and he was given an option. It's the mission or your wife. Your mission or your marriage. You can't have both. So he decided that he would take on the mission. I mean, they'd been married 3 months. I mean, they already had the honeymoon, And he just explained to her, I'll be only getting away 2 or 3 years, it'll be fine, I'll be back, it'll all be good. Now in the meantime, Baudin was sailing, and these scientists, these 22 scientists that he'd had on board, it was a bit like having 22 kids in the back seat of a car going, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? They had no idea of the cramped spaces or the lack of privacy aboard one of these small ships. And they were a real nuisance to Baudin. They got to the Canary Islands and he had to drag these people out of the famous bordellos of the Canary Islands. And if you want any more information about the bordellos, come and see Lou afterwards. He's doing a tour. I told you I'd throw it. But he had to drag them out of these bordellos after only 14 days at sea. They didn't want to go much further. And then they came into the doldrums in the Atlantic Ocean, where there was no wind. They couldn't move. There was very hot conditions, a lot of humidity. The scientists blamed the sailing master. They blamed Baudin for the fact that they were stuck there for 5 weeks in these doldrums, absolutely suffering from the heat. And that caused more friction between the two parties. They got to the Isle de France, or Mauritius, and at that time, as I said, England and France were at war, and there were suspicions that the English planned to invade the Isle de France. Now, the local governor was very concerned about this. He wanted these 2 ships to stay there to help defend the island from the English. And he did everything he possibly could to delay their departure. He went and he offered the sailors aboard these ships extra money to desert and come and be part of his garrison because they were very short-staffed. And 40 men did desert the Baudin expedition. In the end, Baudin had to kidnap 10 slaves that had been working on his ships and promised that they would be freed if they served with him. And he also promised to free more slaves around the island unless the governor stopped trying to take away his men. And this would be a concern for the governor, so he let them go. By this stage, 10 of the scientists had thought they'd had enough and they decided to return to France. So there was now only 12 scientists aboard. Now they also got a lot of plants, took a lot of plants on board at the Isle of France. And this was because, you know, it would be good to have fresh food upon the voyage, but the main purpose was those changes to the sailing orders just before they left by Josephine Bonaparte. If they were going to have to bring fresh, live plants and animals back from New Holland, they'd have to learn how to keep them alive. So they wanted to take these plants with them to study how the best way to keep them alive. And so they brought enormous amounts, dozens and dozens and dozens of different plants on board, including citrus fruits and apples and potatoes, things like that, on board the ship. They cruised across the Indian Ocean and arrived at the west coast of New Holland at a place they called Cape Naturalist, and in Geograph Bay. And these are both still named after the ships just above the southwestern tip of Western Australia. And then it was decided that this was winter time by this stage, and Baudin decided that it was going to be too dangerous to go along the southern coast of Australia during winter because of the feared winds and currents there. So he decided to head up to the north coast. While they were in Geograph Bay, he led a party ashore, and they saw an Aboriginal man, the first Aboriginal they'd seen, and this man gestured to them to go away. They planted some of the trees that they'd brought with them as a gesture to the Aboriginals to say, well, this is another food source for you, I hope you enjoy it. But that party went back after the first day, and but the next day another party went ashore. But they didn't return. People were very concerned about this party. I mean, had they been ambushed by the Aboriginals? Had they just got lost? No one knew. So Baudin ordered that lights be put up on the mast of the ships and that a cannon be fired every 2 hours to try and give a signal for these men to come back. And it was several days before they actually got back. As the ships were about to depart, they saw these men signalling to them from the shore. And by this time, the weather had changed for the worse. And when Baudin sent a boat ashore to pick them up, that boat was smashed against the rocks, and one of the men aboard was killed. That was the first death on this voyage. So they went up north, and Baudin was disappointed that he couldn't find any major harbours or ports. There was no real good anchorages along the western coast of Australia. Every time they went ashore, they couldn't find any food or water, or not much food or water. So he was a little bit disappointed with that. But he had bigger problems, because some of his crew had come down with scurvy. And so he decided to go to the Dutch settlement of Timor to repair the ships, and also to try and nurse his men back to health. When they left there, even worse trouble struck. Dysentery struck the ships. Now, by this time, it was impossible to crew 2 ships. So he put the healthy men aboard the Geograph and the unhealthy men aboard the Naturalist, with orders for them to return to Timor until everyone was able to recover from their illnesses, and then that ship would return to France. Now, in the meantime, Flinders was coming down the west coast of Africa. The Investigator was in poor shape as well. It was taking on water. So they got to Cape Town to conduct repairs. But even as they crossed the Indian Ocean, after those repairs had been done, there was still getting about 5 inches of water into the hull every hour, and the pumps were constantly being used. So you have to remember, these were wooden ships, wooden plank ships, and the gaps between those planks are sealed by something called caulking. And in those days, it was bits of wool and rope and things that had been dipped in oil and wax and grease and things, and stuffed into these holes. But after a while, that would rot, and the timbers would rot as well. So there's constant maintenance on these ships, these old wooden ships. They got across the coast, and Flinders named the very southwestern part of Western Australia, Cape Leeuwin, after the very first Dutch ship to come across and sight that land. And we'll be going around Cape Leeuwin next week. And they stopped in King George Sound, which is the entrance to Albany, which will be next week as well. And there they conducted repairs to the ships, or his ship, and they went ashore, and Flinders was astounded by all the new species of plants and animals and birds that he saw there. And once again, he made first contact with Aboriginal people there. He was in a different situation. His crew were completely fit and healthy. So apart from the ship not being in very good shape, his voyage was in pretty good shape. Now, in the meantime, Baudin came down the west coast of Australia. He came around Cape Leeuwin and then headed for Van Diemen's Land. So that he passed Flinders as Flinders was in King George Sound. He was too far out at sea for the 2 ships to see each other. He then progressed to Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania, and anchored virtually where we were yesterday. He went ashore and he made very good contact with the local Aboriginal people there, the Palawa people, and he and his scientists got on very well. They took lots of samples of the animals and the birds that they saw there, and he made very non-judgmental comments about the Aboriginal people in his logs. There's lots of paintings and drawings that the scientists did while they were in Tasmania. And then he continued up exactly where we are now, up the coast of Tasmania and to the southern part of Australia, into the area is Victoria, where we'll be tomorrow. And then he started heading west across the bottom of Australia, which we'll be doing as well. Now, in the meantime, Flinders was coming from the other way. He had left Albany and he was heading east. And he was forever searching for this channel that separated these 2 continents. Now, as he was coming along, he was frustrated by the fact that there was these huge cliffs guarding the continent. There was nowhere to get ashore, nowhere where he could land. He couldn't get up high enough to see what was beyond these cliffs. And he had no way of exploring inland. And then he came to what we now know as Port Lincoln, just around here. And suddenly the coastline turned to the north, and he thought, wow, could this be it? Could this be the channel to the north of Australia? And he sailed up there for a couple of days, only to discover that no, this was not a channel at all. This was just a large bay, and it's now called the Spencer Gulf, after the earl that sent him on his way. Now, there was also a bit of a catastrophe on the way back. At this point here, which is named Cape Catastrophe, a party of 8 men in a longboat who'd gone ashore to collect water. The boat capsized in heavy seas, and all were lost. All 8 men were lost. So there's 8 islands in that area, and Flinders named each one of those islands after one of those men that had been lost. And this is the entrance to Adelaide. We'll be coming through tomorrow. Kangaroo Island. Now this is Encounter Bay, which is going to be a little bit important in a few minutes. So, as I said, Flinders was sailing east. Cape Catastrophe, he lost some men. Now, he went ashore in that Adelaide area, and he made notes in his diary and in his logs. And in those logs, he mentioned for the very, very first time the word Australians to describe the Aboriginal people that he'd met ashore. And in the meantime, Baudin was sailing from the west. And on April the 8th, 1802, the lookout aboard Flinders' ship suddenly called out that he'd seen a sail. And it was the very first European encounter of 2 countries encountering in Australia. And Flinders named the area Encounter Bay. Flinders cleared for action. He announced action stations. He ran out the guns. Because, as I said, France and England had been at war when they'd left Europe. But Baudin was relying on his passport of safe conduct, and he didn't go into action stations. So they anchored in Encounter Bay. Flinders rowed over to see Baudin, and while they were wary at first, they eventually ended up exchanging information with each other. They explained that neither of them had found this huge channel up the middle of Australia, so there was no channel. They showed each other the charts that they'd made. Flinders had seen that Baudin had made these charts from the eastern part across to the western part, meeting him in Encounter Bay, and the same thing had happened with Flinders. Baudin made a note in his log that the charts and the navigation skills of Flinders, the cartography, were far superior to his own. And Flinders made a note in his log that the scientific achievements of the French were far in excess of their own. So they both had different strengths. And that evening, when high tide came, both ships departed in opposite directions. Baudin continued to sail to the west, and Flinders to the east. He was going past what Baudin had named, the coastline that Baudin had named Terra Napoleon, which is now known as the Shipwreck Coast. Nothing to be worried about. Probably. Yeah, probably, yep. Now, Flinders had a bit of a bad time. The Investigator was in poor shape at this time again, and the winds were coming from the south by this stage, and they were pushing him towards the land. And then once again, I'll emphasise that they couldn't turn on an engine and steer away from the coast. If the wind was pushing you that way, that's the way you were going. And he had to use all of his seamanship skills to stay away from the coast. So he was very, very relieved when they actually came to the eastern part of Australia, and he was able to turn north and head for Port Jackson. And he arrived in Port Jackson on May the 9th of 1802. And he reported to Governor King about what he had done to date. And Governor King was very, very happy to see him. But Flinders was very surprised, with only 11 days later, that the geography with Baudin on board limped into Port Jackson. They could see that something was wrong, so Flinders sent some of his men in a longboat out to see whether they could assist. And they had to actually sail the boat to an appropriate anchorage, because only 8 of the men aboard the geography were in any shape to sail the vessel. There was so much illness aboard Baudin's ship. He had got a little bit further along the southern coast, but decided that because of the illnesses on board, he couldn't proceed, and he had to go to the only settlement on the Australian mainland at that time, which was Port Jackson. But he and Governor King got on very well. They just discovered that peace had been declared again between the two countries. So Governor King treated the Frenchmen extremely well. He invited Baudin, his officers and his scientists to Government House for dinners. They celebrated Bastille Day together. There was an 11-gun salute in their honour. So things were going fairly well. But Flinders suspected that Baudin was going to come out of Port Jackson and head north and chart the northern part of Australia. So he wanted to get the jump on him. So he left Port Jackson in July, sailed north and conducted an extremely detailed survey or cartography of the coastline of Australia. And it was so good that it was still in use decades later. And this was of the Queensland coast and the Gulf of Carpentaria. But when Baudin was in Sydney, as I said, he and Governor King became very good friends. They liked each other a lot. They spent 4 months in Port Jackson, and while they were there, the scientists went crazy with what they'd found there. They loved it. There was so much to see, so many new experiences to see. They were actually the first Europeans invited to an Aboriginal corroboree, which is a festival of music and dance which tells stories about their past, their elders, etc., their ancestors. And while they were in Port Jackson, they collected 40,000 samples on specimens and drawings and live animals and plants and things to take back with them. And they did a lot of interaction with the Aboriginals, as I said. When they went to the corroboree, some of the Frenchmen were actually able to write the musical score of the corroboree. They gave Aboriginal children pencils and paper to draw their own things, and they did a lot of detailed drawings about some of the animals that they found there. And these are now famous drawings in Australia's history. And then after 4 months there, he sailed south for Van Diemen's Land again. Now, after he left, Governor King became concerned because some of the Frenchmen, including Perron, had boasted that they planned to set up a settlement at Van Diemen's Land. Now, King didn't want that at all. He didn't want Frenchmen anywhere near the vicinity. So he sent HMS Cumberland in pursuit, and they caught up with Baudin and the geography at King Island in Bass Strait. And Marines went ashore, British Marines went ashore. They fired a volley of a rifle fire into the air. They raised a flag, and the captain of the Cumberland told Baudin that this was British territory. We've claimed this island, we've claimed Van Diemen's Land, we've claimed everything. Now, Baudin was insulted by this. He said that we never planned to claim any of this. How could you? It's already owned by someone. He wrote a letter, very, very famous letter to Governor King, saying that, you know, England hasn't got a right to this, France hasn't got a right to this, it's already owned by our people. We've never planned to make a settlement in Van Diemen's Land because we haven't been invited to do so. Now, when that word got out back to Napoleon about this later on, he became furious about what he'd been told. They then sailed west across the bottom of Australia and then north to Timor again. And once again, the crew of this the geography was in pretty bad shape. But Baudin himself was in very bad shape. He had contracted tuberculosis. He was coughing up blood into a handkerchief each day. In the ship's surgeon's log, on 2 occasions over a couple of weeks, how he writes there that he doesn't expect the captain to last more than a few hours. But Baudin did survive, and he decided that he was going to continue this exploration along the north coast of Australia. Even though this was going to be a terrible voyage, because it was going to be against the prevailing monsoon winds. And so even though he tried that, they didn't get very far. And eventually it wasn't the fact that he was sick, it wasn't the fact that his crew was sick, it was the fact that some of the animals, some of the live animals and plants on board the ship were becoming distressed themselves. So he thought that he had to get this great treasure that he had on board back to France. And that was the reason that he decided to abandon the mission and head back to France. And he set sail for the Isle de France. Now, in the meantime, Flinders had gone to northern Australia. He had done the cartography, as I was telling you about. He'd been hit by these monsoons, and the Investigator was falling apart. It was rotting by this stage. He beached the boat. He conducted as much repairs as he could, but then he decided that there was no way I could continue this voyage. He was around about the part where Darwin is at the moment, if you know Darwin, at the central northern part of Australia. And he decided that he couldn't go back the way he had come because of the monsoon winds, so he would have to go the other way, go anti-clockwise, all the way around Australia back to Port Phillip Bay. And in doing so, this was the very first close circumnavigation of the continent. And during that voyage, 19 of his men died, which made up about a third of his crew. And when the ship finally got back to Port Jackson or Sydney, it was condemned as being unseaworthy. They couldn't go any further in it at all. Now, he knew that Baudin had a head start on him, and so he immediately got all his papers and his logs and his charts and everything, and he joined a fleet of ships that was heading back to England because he wanted to get his work published. He was only going to be a passenger aboard this ship, and the ship set sail up the coast of Australia. Now, I know a lot of overseas visitors think that everything in Australia is out to kill you, but the most dangerous thing in Australia at that time was the Great Barrier Reef. And 2 of the ships were shipwrecked, including Flinders' ship was shipwrecked on what's now is Wreck Reef off the coast of Queensland. All the men made it to a sandbar for safety, and they used a mast to hoist a flag upside down, which is the international code for I am in distress. Now, the 3rd ship, the Bridgewater, sailed straight on past without stopping. He could see that the other 2 ships had been shipwrecked, but it kept on going. And when it got back to England, the captain reported that the other 2 ships had been wrecked on the reef and there'd been no survivors. He was later, when it was found out that that wasn't true, he was court-martialed and drummed out of the Navy for cowardice. So they knew that there was not much hope of rescue at this location. So Flinders volunteered, because of his skill in small boats, he volunteered to lead a rescue mission back to Port Jackson. And he boarded a small vessel with 13 other men, and they made this epic voyage, 600 nautical miles back to Port Jackson to tell Governor King what would happen. And he then led a rescue mission back to the Wreck Reef, where they were able to rescue all the men apart from 3 that had died during that time there. Now, one of the men that they rescued was Flinders' brother, who had come out to join him, and another one was John Franklin, who went on to become Lieutenant Governor of Tasmania and the leader of the Lost Franklin expedition, who went to search the doomed expedition that went to search for the Northwest Passage. He then boarded another vessel. He took command of HMS Cumberland, and he set sail for England. Now, in the meantime, Baudin had gotten to the Isle de France. He was gravely ill by this stage, and he eventually succumbed and died on the 16th of September 1803. And he was buried in an unmarked grave. We don't know where his grave is at all. Perron then took command of the mission, and he sailed back to France, and arrived there with great fanfare 3.5 years after they'd left that country. And with them they brought 200,000 articles. So that's live and dead specimens of birds, animals, fish, insects, plants, as well as drawings and charts, navigational equipment and things. Now that included 2,500 new species that no one had ever seen before. Now, I say that and I read that and it's pretty hard to comprehend. So the only way I can really do it is to suggest that, say 3.5 years ago, NASA or Elon Musk or someone sent an expedition, a ship, a spacecraft to another world. And as soon as they were out of sight, we lost all communication with them. We don't know where they are. We have no idea. There's no communication. We don't know whether they're alive or dead. Have no idea at all. And then today, suddenly, without warning, they appear. And they've got with them 2,500 new species that we've never seen before. Now, that would cause a bit of a media frenzy, wouldn't it? You'd think it'd get some of the rubbish that's on the front page now off the front page, and this would be huge news. And that's the only way I can really describe it. It's just incredible to me that 2,500 new species. Sir Joseph Banks, as I said before, England and France were at war, but because of the nature of this discovery, all these English scientists were given permission to go and see this work. And Sir Joseph Banks later said that it was the greatest scientific collection in history. And I can't think of one that's surpassed it since then. And he said it was the greatest voyage of scientific discovery in the history of the world as well. Josephine Bonaparte came down to the ships to meet the ship, and she took most of the live animals and plants back to her palace at Malmaison, and she created an Australian biosphere there, and you can still visit Malmaison and still see some of these plants that were planted at the time. Perron argued for and negotiated with Napoleon for the rights to write the official account of this voyage, and he was given that job. And in that report, which is over thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, and it's got all this information and charts and drawings in there, the leader of the expedition, Baudin, who Perron hated, is only mentioned in there once in the whole journal. And that's just to say that he died. He completely destroyed Baudin's reputation. And in fact, Napoleon was so incensed with what Perron had told him about what Baudin had did in Van Diemen's Land, that he said that Baudin did well to die. Upon his return, I would have had him hung. Now, Perron also violated the terms of the safe conduct passport. He told Napoleon about the defences at Port Jackson, and he devised a plan that if Napoleon wanted to, he could invade Port Jackson and take over the colony of Australia. And the French actually drew up plans to do that. Now, it's still not known to this day whether Napoleon really had ideas to do that, or whether it was just a ruse to get the British to send more resources to New South Wales, thus lessening the defences in Europe. But Perron also changed a lot of the names that Baudin had put on the charts to suit himself. And he also even changed some of the names that Flinders had put on the chart, which was to anger Flinders. Now, Flinders had been aboard HMS Cumberland. He was racing back to England. He got to the point where the Cumberland was in terrible condition as well. And he didn't really like the idea of travelling around the Cape of Good Hope in this vessel the way it was. So he reluctantly decided that he would have to put into the Isle de France for repairs. He didn't know that England and France were at war again. So he pulled in there on this December 17th, 1803, one day after Peron and geography had pulled out and sailed for France. And that was going to be a big problem for him, because he had his passport of safe conduct as well, but it was for the Investigator, not for the Cumberland. And so the governor of the Isle de France thought this must be a trick. This guy was a spy. And Flinders was arrested and thrown into prison. And he was kept on house arrest for 6.5 years, until his health was so bad that he was released. So he was released and finally arrived back in England after being away for 10 years. He had a little bit of explaining to do to his missus. You know, I said I'd only be 2 or 3 years, but I've been away for a while. He was in very, very poor health, but he used all his remaining energy to write an account of his voyage. Not all of his energy, because he did have the energy to father a child with Anne, but at the age of 40, on July 19th, 1814, he went into a coma and he died. The very next day, his work, the Voyage to Terra Australis, was published, and he didn't see a copy of it published. And in that document, he advocates for the term Australia, for this new country, this new land, which means the Great Southern Land. And he'll go down as one of the greatest navigators in the history of the world. There's lots of statues to Flinders all around Australia and in England, commemorating his work. There's also, he's been on Australian currency several times. And even his cat, Trim, has been commemorated with statues around the world. Now, Trim was born aboard HMS Reliance during Flinders' first voyage to Australia. And he'd actually fallen off the ship, and the crew were very impressed with the fact that this cat had climbed up a rope to save itself and come back on board. And Flinders had adopted the cat. And it had been with him on every single voyage that he'd gone on. So his voyages in the Tom Thumb and Tom Thumb 2, his circumnavigation of Tasmania, his circumnavigation of Australia. It was on the shipwreck when he got shipwrecked. It was on the boat that he took back to Sydney to get help, and it went with him and was under house arrest himself while the Flinders was at the Isle of France. And Trim went missing in the Isle of France. He was probably taken by a hungry slave and eaten. But Flinders wrote a book about his friend, and you can find this book at several locations. I saw it at the museum in Hobart yesterday. But the man who led the greatest scientific expedition of all time, Baudin, hasn't got anything to his name. There's a statue of him and Flinders at Encounter Bay, but if you ask, a survey done recently, and 95% of Australians have either never heard of him or don't know much about his work, and 96% of French people have never heard of him or don't know much about his work. And this is just incredible to me, and some of us are trying to change that at the moment. Now, only a couple of months ago, in January of this year, Flinders' body was discovered under platform 15 at Euston Station in London. They were doing renovations to the station, and they came across a graveyard, and his body was identified by a brass plate on his coffin. And so there's talk now with his family about whether he'll be re-interned in England or his body will be brought out to Australia for burial in Australia. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the man who named Australia. I hope you've enjoyed that. My next talk's in a couple of days' time, and I'll be talking to you about some great heroes that you've probably never heard of, including the man who stole the Suez Canal. But in the meantime, go Pies!